Time for weather now, and in place of our usual weekly forecast, we're speaking with Nebraska climatologists Martha Shulski and Al Dutcher about the year in weather for 2019. And from storms to snow to flooding, it was a wild one. So Martha, we'll start with you. If you could give us a recap of what we saw this past winter in Nebraska, some of the highlights.
Yeah, the winter of 2018-2019 was pretty interesting. So Lincoln and Omaha both did set records for snowfall totals. They were both over 50 inches. The winter season as a whole, December, January, February, was 7th coldest on record, or 7th wettest on record for the state. And that was primarily for the eastern two-thirds of the state, not necessarily in the panhandle. We were slightly cooler than normal for December, January, February. But the big news came in February. That's where we were in the top 10 coldest on record going back to 1895 for the whole state of Nebraska.
And Al, let's move on to you for a second. Was there anything that happened in 2018 that indicated that 2019 was going to be a particularly messy winter?
The only thing that we really had going for us in terms of moisture was that area that was persistently wet in southern Minnesota, northern Iowa, northeast Nebraska, southeastern South Dakota. The major issue is that we had an ample amount of moisture and a very wet pattern that was highlighted by an El Nino, so the southerly flow was very extensive last winter, and most of our heavy precip up through the end of January was confined to the central southern plains, not the northern plains. It is in February where we're seeing that switch to the very cold pattern. It took extraordinary circumstances first to get to the point that we got to with all the flooding this spring.
And then Martha, when we get into March, we had that flooding. How did the impacts from all the snowfall in January and February and even into March contribute to that flooding?
Yeah, so the stage was really set. We had a very cold February that allowed the soils that were already saturated because we had been so wet over a long period of time to freeze deeply. So we've got this frozen saturated soils. We've got a few inches of water equivalent in the snowpack sitting on the ground, so that when we did have that March blizzard that came through 13th and 14th, we had blizzard conditions in the west and then rain in the east, and that allowed for a pretty rapid snow melt. And so the ice that was sitting on the rivers, the snow that was sitting on the landscape, it had nowhere to go. It was not infiltrating into the ground.
And what happened with the snow and the flooding really set the stage for a terrible year for producers. What commodity was the one that was most impacted?
That's a tough one. Of course, corn was really impacted during planting, and we've seen the worst of those situations over extreme eastern Nebraska, northeast, and then points off to our east and north. But one of the things that's kind of been missed, and I've been hearing a lot about this, has been we had a great forage growth with all the rainfall, but it had contained a lot of water, didn't have the protein content. We had a lot of problems with calving, lost cattle during the floods, but more importantly, as we get back into the breeding portion of the equation in the fall, there is some talk, at least, that conditioning due to the low protein content of these large amounts of forages was a contributing factor in some of the lower take rates basically through the breeding. So I think both sides could argue this, but in this early part of the year, I think corn was a bigger impact outside of the losses that we had during calving. At the fall, I think the biggest issue for us is going to be conception rates on the cattle that were coming in to be breeding.
And then Martha, when we move on to spring and summer, compared to what we saw earlier in the year, fairly mild, but what were some of the high points here?
Yeah, so the heavy precipitation that we could get, that kind of continued into the summer. So in early July, the Kearney area and really about a 10-county area in Nebraska received over 4 inches of rainfall in a 2-day period. I believe the highest total was almost 9 inches near Loomis, which is a very high total for a 2-day period. So the Kearney area did experience some impacts. Later in the summer, the Ainsworth area, they experienced quite a bit of precipitation in a 2-day period that did hamper some flood recovery efforts. So there were some cases of high-intensity convective rainfall events that did happen. And August, in fact, was the wettest on record in Nebraska, again going back to 1895. So we continue that wet trend that we did have. And in fact, 2019 year to date, so January through November, we are 4th wettest on record.
All right, and Al, I'll have you look at the Al Dutcher crystal ball here, predicting what could be in store for 2020. What are you thinking right now?
It's been a tough call. You know, I actually thought it would be a lot more stormier here in the Central Plains than what we have seen. We have seen an active weather pattern, but most of the systems have passed to the north or to the south of us. Last year we were in an El Nino. We had a lot of southerly flow type direction. This year we're seeing more, at least in October and November, most of our flow was coming out of the northerly flow. We had 24 straight days in Omaha with below normal temperatures, kind of eerily similar to the same setup that we had during February with the cold push of Arctic air into our region. So as long as we don't freeze this ground up, we can get a semblance of decent normal precipitation and not excessively heavy snowfall, we have a chance to mitigate some of this flooding, because as long as that ground isn't froze, anything on the surface that's still standing there will work its way down into the deeper profile.